All right, the slides, I just saw a question in there. The slides are going to be posted in the chat, and so you'll see them in there as soon as they're available. So they're loading right now as we speak. So we'll get those to you in just a moment. So as I said, welcome to our Summer Institute. Typically, this time of year, we've done what we call a new directors workshop. And this year, we decided to do something different. Actually, those of you who are going to the CASFET conference, there will be a new directors workshop. But we wanted to do something a little different to try and give you sort of a head start on the year and look at some of the foundational laws, regulations that cross both program and fiscal requirements, because we're seeing more and more of that where the two are aligned. So we want to kind of give you an overview, some of the regulations and laws, and hopefully allow you to put systems in place to support your districts with that. So today and tomorrow, you're going to hear from me, from Rachel Garcia and Adrian Balcazar of our team, who'll be sharing some information, and hopefully that helps you get a good start to the year. So I guess this is an official welcome back from us, since this is our first meeting for a while. All right, next slide. All right, so these are some of the topics we're going to be talking about today, and this is a 2-day series. We'll be here from 3 to 4:30 today and tomorrow, and it's kind of some heavy information, so we dropped it into 2 different settings so you don't have to get on overload. But we're going to be looking at Office of Management and Budget, grants guidance, and that serves as a foundation for many of your federal program requirements. So we're going to spend some time looking at that. And then within that is something called federal cost principles. And those are key to determining allowability of costs in federal programs. And then we'll look at one of the areas that we get lots of questions on, and for good reason, because it's a challenging area and can affect your funding and payback of fund if there are compliance findings, and that's time and effort reporting. We'll also look at internal controls, which are part of the Uniform Grants Guidance, and then we'll spend some time on policies and procedures and what's required and how those can support you in having compliant programs. So next, we just wanted to share with you a couple of resources, and the link is there, and we'll also be putting it in the chat. And these are a couple of documents that are available through our publications that might be helpful to you. The Fiscal Fundamentals Guide and support documents will provide information on some of the topics we're going to address today, but it also provides some examples from various sources that you can pull and use for policies, procedures, time and effort, and some other things that might be helpful in relation to your federal programs. In addition, we have a booklet specifically on time and effort reporting that goes into more detail on that. So those two are available on our website. Questions on the next slide. If you'll put the questions in the chat today, we're going to try and stop in time to take some of your questions, but we'd also appreciate if you put questions in there that may be topics we're going to hit on tomorrow. If so, that's much appreciated, so we can tailor the presentation tomorrow to fit your needs. Also, we will do a follow-up, and tomorrow, before we get started, we'll try and take a few minutes and follow up on any questions that we either don't get to today or those that leave us scratching our head and we have to do a little bit more research for you on. So please do share your questions in the chat. So let's take a look at why, a little deeper, the purpose today. We decide what should be different this year. And what we want to do in these 2 days is to provide you with an overview of fundamental requirements, primarily for federal programs, and give you the source of those legal requirements to also help you put systems in place to ensure your fiscal and programmatic requirements associated with these programs are met, and to be prepared for reporting requirements associated with these programs. One of the things we hear, especially from new directors, is, how would I know that was coming? I didn't even know that was required. And suddenly a report is sitting on your desk that's due the next day. So we're trying to hopefully give you some heads up on some things you can put in place to avoid that. We also want to spend a little bit of time clarifying the differences and the similarities between state and federal program requirements. And then we also want to support you and with your program and fiscal people in understanding how these two align, how fiscal and program compliance are intertwined, and the two really do work together more than ever. That's the case. So we've said for years you need to be a team and work together, and that's more true than ever. So next, this is for those of you in the program office might be saying, wait a minute, that's not me. I do the program work. I don't do fiscal. Well, fiscal requirements are a part of your job too. And we're finding that a lot of the program pieces actually do have a fiscal component. And those are the things that sometimes hit you from behind when you don't know that these are coming, or you don't know what's being taken care of in the business office. So just want to put these on your radar. So they are in your wheelhouse now. Next slide just kind of reiterates that it is a team effort, that fiscal staff may process the payments, but program staff need to be involved in determining allowability. So there's one area where you're connected. Fiscal staff track reporting grant expenditures, but program staff make decisions about spending. So you need to be aware of timelines. So on both sides, you need to be aware of timelines. Both program and fiscal staff need to be aware of and follow district procedures to make sure that they are following their own policies and procedures for purchasing of items and maintaining documentation for that. And then finally, program staff need to review charges to make sure things are charged to the right accounts. So all of this is really to minimize risks, because you are the overseer, the responsible party for these public funds that are allocated to you for services for students. And that is the responsibility of the LEA. And you'll see that that's clearly the direction from the U.S. Department of Education, that LEAs are the responsible people for this, for public funds. You have oversight of it, and they're going to tell you the what that needs to happen, but the how is really happening at the district level. So let's take a look at a few of the documents we'll be looking at and talking about today. And some of these will use different terms sometimes and want to know which one we're talking about. Most of you are familiar with ESSA. That is the current reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So that's sometimes confusing to people, like what's ESEA and what's ESSA? Well, 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was first authorized, and every few years, and that kind of depends on the initial authorization, it needs to be reauthorized. And essentially, each administration at the federal level puts their mark on it. The last one was No Child Left Behind, and that was last reauthorized in 2015. So ESSA are the laws that we're operating under now for federal programs. Next to that, you see something called UGG, and some people think that refers to an adjective, what we think of it, but actually it's the Uniform Grants Guidance, and it also is referred to as the Code of Federal Regulations, because that really is what it is. Section 200 of the Code of Federal Regulations are regulations from the Office of Management and Budget that are designed to cover all federal programs. They cover all federal programs in various parts. Part 200 covers all federal education programs. So you'll see even institutes of higher education are also included in the Uniform Grants Guidance. But any funds that go out to educational agencies are covered under the Uniform Grants Guidance. So they provide additional requirements. Csam is an acronym, I'm sure very familiar to those of you who are in the fiscal office, California School Accounting Manual, and much of it is going to be something that many of you are going to want to skim over if you are doing program work, but there are some sections, particularly those on time and effort reporting, some other sections that are very valuable. So we wanted to put that on your radar because it includes some guidance that can be supportive to you in charging your expenditures correctly. EDGAR is the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, And these regulations are actually based on the Code of Federal Regulations, which you see above. They are specific to programs that are operated out of the Department of Education. There are many educational programs, not all of them come out of the U.S. Department of Education. So Edgar focuses on those requirements. It's less extensive than the Code of Federal Regulations or the Uniform Grants Guidance, but it is specific to education programs out of the department, which are typically what you work with. So those are just some documents that we'll be referring to. Next slide is, and I think Christine just shared the link, perhaps to the slides, so you can pull those up. So let's start by talking about a couple basic terms that are important in this discussion, and that has to do with restricted and unrestricted funds. And unrestricted funds simply refers to funds that come essentially without legal restraints, and they can be used for any purpose not prohibited by law for educational agencies. So if an educational agency, if there's nothing saying you can't do it, your unrestricted funds is something that you are allowed to do. Restricted funds, on the other hand, are subject to constraints, and those might be imposed by the provider of the funds. So wherever those funds come from, there may be restrictions placed upon those funds. So those are significantly different, I would say, than unrestricted funds. And if you have programs that are funded with a combination of restricted and unrestricted funds, the California School Accounting Manual says that those need to operate as restricted programs. Okay, so the more restrictive trumps sort of the reporting if you have both funds included. Let's take a closer look at unrestricted. So this usually refers to what most of us would talk about as general funds. And these are the main operating budget for the local education agency. And while they're unrestricted, LEAs are subject to requirements and obligations that have to be met using those unrestricted funds. For example, Williams requirements are a requirement for school districts, and they need to be met using unrestricted funds. So while they're unrestricted, there are things that need to be paid for. Also, they're used to implement core programs. Those are basic services for all students. This includes supporting equity and civil rights requirements, such as English language development. That is a core function, and that needs to come out of general funds. Now, LCFF is kind of a hybrid program, and that makes it kind of a little bit confusing. LCFF funds are all unrestricted funds, so they can be used for any cost not prohibited by a law. But LEAs have an obligation with those funds, and that obligation is to use the additional funds that are generated by low-income students, English learners, and foster youth to increase or improve services for those students in proportion to the additional funds they generate. So while the funds taken as a whole are unrestricted in that they can be used for any legally allowable purpose, the obligation remains to those particular student groups. So you can see unrestricted funds are unrestricted in that what you can do, but districts and charter schools still have requirements that need to be met, and that's what those general funds are meant for. Now let's turn to restricted funds. And these are funds that are constrained could be by law, by regulations, or it might be from the agency or entity that provides those funds. So you may have a community-based organization that provides funds to a school district, but they want them spent for a particular purpose. Those then are restricted funds. Local government, private donors, all of those, if they put restrictions on what they want the funds are used for, then those funds are restricted. I heard someone say they talked to a donor and they said, we don't want restrictions, just give us the money. But sometimes those come with strings, and those strings make them restricted. Most restricted programs, though, are state or federal programs, particularly federal formula grants are all restricted programs because they have rules associated with them. And most competitive grants, unless they're totally block grants, most competitive grants also are restricted. State funds, in some cases, those would be restricted, and that's if they are a particular, what we used to call categorical programs. But if they're a program that's separately legislated, that has separate rules, then they're restricted. Just think, if you have rules that you have to follow and you have reporting that's required, that puts them into that restricted category. So these 2 days, we're going to focus primarily on restricted funds because that's where the challenge comes in meeting those restrictions. All right, so federal programs, typically they're the most restrictive programs. There are a number of ways that programs are regulated. The first is statute. Okay, the statute is the authorizing law. And for most federal programs, that is the Every Student Succeeds Act. In some cases, the statute for state programs is the California Education Code, because the legislature makes a law. Those are translated into ed codes. So those are ways that law defines what the requirements of a program are. The ed relief funds that were authorized over the past 3 years to address COVID have their own statutes, and those were based on enacting legislation. And these and other federal programs are all subject to the Uniform Grants Guidance. So keep in mind, all those ed relief funds, the ESSER funds, GEAR funds, those were subject to federal requirements in the Office of Management and Budget document. The Code of Federal Regulations set forth by the Office of Management and Budget, again, governs all federal programs. So that's the Code of Federal Regulations, Uniform Grants Guidance. Education Department General Administration, as we said, it provides additional detail specific to programs that go to local education agencies and to state agencies. And then the California also has its own code of regulations, and the California Code of Regulations codifies guidance that comes out of the California Department of Education when it goes through a process, and sometimes you call and you get an opinion, but if it's codified, it'll be in the Code of Regulations, California Code of Regulations. So sometimes there are surprises that pop up there. So all of those are rules and statutes that govern federal and some state programs. The next slide shows kind of a picture of how these programs should work together. And essentially, we're going from the least restrictive at the bottom to the most restrictive at the top. So you can see how that kind of flows. LCFF-based funds can pretty much be used for any allowable purpose. They are unrestricted, and that provides for basic services for all your students, for ethnic groups, students with disabilities, but very flexible funding at the state level. LCFF supplemental and concentration is also unrestricted funding. However, it needs to be used to increase or improve services for those 3 groups so they meet the LEA's goals for meeting state and local priority. Title 2 and 4 are next on the list because they have a supplement, not supplant provision, which state funds don't. So federal funds have to supplement and not supplant your state and local funds. So these should go on top of your LCFF funds. And they're for services for professional development or for well-rounded education, safe and healthy students, and technology. So you can see the use of these is fairly broad. They're also district level. So not all programs are district level, but some of them are. So the district has a lot of discretion in using those 2 funding sources. Next comes Title I. Title I, again, is supplemental program, has a lot more rules and requirements associated with it, and it's a school level program. So schools have to have a part in developing plans and have a say in that. So you can see there's more restrictions in terms of school plans and requirements for Title I. And then at the very top, and any of you who work with this program, I'm sure know that, is Title III. Title III is the most restrictive of the programs that you're receiving, and that's because Title III has to supplement not only your state and local funds, so your LCFF base, your LCFF supplemental, but it also has to be supplemental to other federal program funds. So anything you do with Title III needs to be above and beyond what you're doing with Title II and IV. So that kind of gives you a sense of how restriction works in terms of unrestricted at the bottom, moving all the way up to the most restrictive in Title III. Right. Next, we'll look at statutes. We mentioned statutes are where things start. And statute simply means the law establishing or authorizing the program. Title 1, 2, 3, and 4 all have statutes included in the Every Student Succeeds Act. So if you go in there, you will find the law that describes what's required for Title 1, Title 2, Title 3, and Title 4. That's one level of requirement that must be met. They typically begin, most of these programs begin with the intent and purpose of the statute, which sets the groundwork for the law. It describes who's meant to benefit, what's the program meant to accomplish. This can feel sort of like the fluffy part. It's not. Okay. The intent and purpose really can be helpful when you go back to determining an allowable cost. What is this program designed to do, and who is it designed to serve? And that's where you need to start when you start determining your use of funds. A lot of other things to consider, but that's a great place to start with the law. What's the program about? We often find that some district people who have been put in to oversee a program really don't have grounding in the intent and purpose. And once they get that, the programs really flow, and they tend to be compliant programs if you're following the intent and purpose. Some programs include specific lists of allowable costs or activities. And some, such as Title III, include two kinds of lists. One is required activities, and the other are allowable activities. So sometimes you'll find those in Title II and Title III both have some lists of allowable costs. Sometimes they're very clear and specific, and sometimes they're a little bit vague, but you can find those costs in some programs. Other programs, like Title I, don't provide a list of allowable costs, but they provide parameters for determining the allowability of costs. This is where it gets frustrating for many of you. Well, I want a list. What can I do and what I can't do? And for Title I, they don't give you a list. What they give you are parameters, and there are a lot of processes that need to be in place, including a school-wide plan and input and school site council. So a lot of pieces that make it, is this allowable, as opposed to 2 and 3 that have a list of programs. The laws governing each program are specific only to that program. So if you're looking for what's required, the law will tell you, and the law is the highest level on the authority of what's allowable. Go to the law first. Now let's look at the regulation. Okay. Regulations generally provide more detail and more specificity than the law. If you've ever read perhaps a bill that's come out or looked at legal requirements, either federal or an ed code, sometimes you go, what does that mean? The statement is kind of maybe vague or unclear, and regulations tend to clarify that, whether they're federal or state regulations. That's sort of the purpose of them, is to say, okay, now let's get down a little bit more to the nitty-gritty and look at it. What does this mean? So these requirements, as I mentioned earlier, are published by the Office of Management and Budget. And in totality, they cover all federally funded programs for all agencies. So there are out of the Code of Federal Regulations, there are sections that govern the health department and transportation and all the agencies. The one we care about is Part 200, which is specific to programs that are educational. And the U.S. Department of Education develops regulations that support this, and that's where we find the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, EDGAR. EDGAR is based on the Office of Management and Budget, Part 200, okay, Code of Federal Regulations. They take that and then they narrow it to look specifically at education programs. There's two parts to EDGAR. Part 75 addresses direct grant programs. Those are programs that you apply for directly to the U.S. Department of Education. Very few districts have those programs, but sometimes there's a program you have to apply directly to the U.S. Department. Most of ours are in Part 76, and that addresses what we call state-administered programs. So all our ESSA programs are state-administered, meaning they go through the State Department of Education, and the funds come to the local, and then CDE has oversight responsibility for those funds. Another section of the regulations we hope you don't know too much about is GEPA, and that's because primarily GEPA is about enforcement, and that's after you have a problem. So if you have a federal audit, GEPA includes regulations that cover how you might appeal that, and there are a number of things it's definitely worth looking at, and particularly if you have legal office, you'll probably be working with your legal office. If you have a federal audit, you're going to want them to look at GEPA to find out what are the things you can maybe make a case for to lower or eliminate your payback of funds. Finally, the California Code of Regulations. It's the codification, again, of general and permanent rules announced by CDE that goes through a regulatory process. We don't think of that in terms of federal programs, but there are things in the Code of Federal Regulations that do apply to your federal program. Okay, next are who checks on these processes? Lots of people, okay. Probably who you're most familiar with is the first one, Federal Program Monitoring, or FPM. What FPM is, this is the state's process for meeting their responsibility to monitor federal program requirements in LEAs. So they, and in some of the monitoring, it does include some state restricted programs. So see, the U.S. Department of Education, the funds go to the California Department of Education. They allocate them out to the states, and CDE has responsibility to oversee those programs at all LEAs. And the way they do that's through the FPM process. Okay? And LEAs are selected for reviews based on a risk assessment that has to do with the amount of money you're getting and how many programs you have. So they put this through a risk assessment, and that's how LEAs are selected. State audits, on the other hand, are focused on state-funded programs, and these are annual audits that are conducted with an outside auditor based on requirements in the state audit guide, and that's updated annually, and that's good to know if you're responsible for state programs. Federal audits are connected to the state audits, and these are called, they used to be called A133 audits, but they're essentially any district that gets over, any LEA that receives over $700,000 in federal funds is required to have an annual audit of their federal programs, and this is aligned with the state audit process. And auditors follow something called a compliance supplement. You'll see the link down at the bottom for that. Each year, Office of Management and Budget updates that to say, what are the risky areas that we really want to focus on? So if you're getting ready for your federal audit, looking through that is helpful to see what are they focusing on this year in the federal audit process. And then Inspector General audits are something else we hope you have no experience with, because they're conducted by the Office of Inspector General for the Education Department, and they typically are based on an underlying issue or problem that comes up. They peruse the local newspapers, they get tips. You can call 1-800-MISUSED if you think funds are being misused in a school district, and the Inspector General's office may knock on your door and come calling. We've had some districts who go, who's that? And they kind of ignore it. Do not ignore the Inspector General. Talk to your cabinet, make sure everyone's aware, and respond to them immediately, and because that means they're seeing something that's a significant problem about misuse of federal funds, and they will be at your door. So that's one, again, we hope you don't get to that point. All right, now let's dig into the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards. That's a mouthful. That's why they call it UGG. Okay, Uniform Grants Guidance. Again, this is in Part 200, the Code of Federal Regulations. They apply to all federal grants, whether they're, as I said, whether through the U.S. Department or not, if it's an education program. So you will see some things in there that aren't really applicable to you because they have to do with university programs. But about 5 years ago, those of you who've been around a while know that about 5 years ago, they pulled together a group of documents called OMB circulars. And there were circulars that were for all sorts of programs, and they were very specific. And for education programs, all of us were very familiar with OMB A87. Okay, that was specific to local education agencies. Instead, they said, let's revise it and pull all these requirements for education programs together. I say all that just as kind of a warning. If you're going through your documents and getting ready for an audit or review, and you see documents that reference OMB A87, it's time to update them because that's out of date. And that'll be a clue to an auditor you haven't updated your policies, procedures, or other documents. So just get that out of there. Make sure you're referencing the Code of Federal Regulations. So on the next slide, we'll take a look. What is this? First of all, it is accessible on Google online. So just Google 2 CFR 200. And if you know a specific section you're looking for, it's there. Otherwise, you can see the whole document will pop up for you. So that's the easiest way to access it. It's called Grants Guidance. That's misleading because this isn't guidance. These are requirements. The Office of Management and Budget, again, they pull them together. I mentioned they come from those various circulars, and it is a government framework for grants management. And it is, as they say, the authoritative set of rules and requirements for federal awards, and it synthesizes all the guidance from those previous circulars. And the bottom line, how's that used? This is the guidance used for your federal audits, and they focus on areas of waste, fraud, and abuse in federal programs. So digging deeper into it, on the next slide, we'll look at one section of it that I want to draw your attention to because there's a lot in there, and some of it is very much really going to be the domain of the fiscal office, but the federal cost principles are important to everyone working on federal programs. They provide guidelines for determining allowability of costs, and they are sort of the first cut at determining allowability. And there's the cost principles you'll see being used more and more by monitoring offices and reviewers, particularly for Title I, because Title I is so broad. They look now to the cost principles to kind of pull in the specific areas that you need to look at. So anyone, it's in section 200.400, and it's important for anyone who works with federal programs who signs off on expenditures being allowable or not. They should be familiar with this because they are a key factor in determining if a cost can be charged to an award, and everything in there has to be met for it to be allowable. So let's take a look at the next slide, section 400. Okay, LEA. This section starts with kind of a message. Then the message is, and that goes throughout the whole guidance, that the non-federal agency, that's you, okay, the local, is responsible for efficient and effective administration of the award. It's your responsibility through your sound management practice that you assume responsibility. When you had someone in your office sign the consolidated application, they signed assurances. And those assurances said they would essentially follow the rules for the program. So you'll see this repeated over and over again, that you, the non-federal entity, has the primary responsibility for doing whatever organization or management techniques that are necessary to ensure proper administration of the grant. And they point out this shouldn't require significant changes in your internal policies and practices. If you're doing things right now, you can maintain those practices, but they're sort of very heavily putting it on you. Okay. And it goes on to say that, yeah, you shouldn't have to change anything. So bottom line means that they're not telling you how to do it, but they're telling you what to do. Okay. Let's take a look now at what's in the cost principles. And again, they have to be used for determining the allowable costs. So if you're looking, often we get the question, is this allowable? Well, this is a place to look. So next slide is starts with a list of this is what's in the cost principles. And you can see the first three are in red because those are the biggies. Okay. You're going to see necessary, reasonable, and allocable. We'll go through each of these, but those are the top three that are usually that carry the most weight, although they're all required, but they're ones that people have questions about. The next, some of these make sense if you just read what it says there, but others are kind of like, what does that mean? So of course, not prohibited under state or local law. So you can't do something that's illegal in your state with federal money. Treated consistently. We'll talk about that in a minute. Adequately documented. Well, I was saying, make sure you have documentation for everything. Not included as a match, and net of applicable credits, which is the one that kind of confuses people. So let's dig in here and take a look at what they are. Necessary is number one, and necessary is essentially a program determination. Okay, so we're talking on the program side. It's to be allowable. It has a cost has to be necessary for the performance of the grant, and that means you need that to achieve the program objective. So first, you need to know, what are your program objectives, and the question is, where are those? Where are those defined? In some cases, they're in plans, various school plans, but where are your other programs? Where's Title II? Where's Title III? How are your program objectives defined, so you know if that cost is necessary to support the program? So you have to have those first. For Title I school-wide schools, that's critical. That's a huge piece. That's why the plan is so critical. That's how you determine that a cost is necessary. Okay? That's often the problem with often the basis for problems with allowability. People say, well, can I spend this on? And the question, well, is why? And what objective does it support? So those need to be questions that you're able to answer from the program side, and a plan is where necessary should be defined. It's necessary because here's the objective in a plan. And I know you guys hate it when you call about school plans, and we can tell you how your school plans need to be tight, they need to be clear, they need to align with needs. This is because you need to be able to demonstrate that cost is necessary. And what is it you're trying to achieve? One piece where this overlaps with the next one, which is reasonable, is the question that often comes out is a particular item really necessary, and is the cost reasonable? And these overlap in an area where you try and you want to order a higher priced item, and there is a lower priced item. The question is, could the lower priced item suffice? So if you put in an order for a whiz-bang computer that does all kinds of things that I couldn't even tell you about, that computes and does things that you need in higher mathematics maybe, or calculators that do something in particular, then you need to show how that is necessary to the program. Because the question would be, could you use a more basic device if you're teaching, if it's for reading, if it's just for a reading program, or if it's to use for particular software? So I mean, it's on you to make the case that this is what I need, because as the steward of the funds, you have to make a call that this is necessary. And on the next slide, we'll look at reasonable. So let's go to reasonable. And reasonableness is primarily a fiscal determination. Okay? And they use this thing called the prudent person standard we'll look at in a minute. But what the guidance talks about is market price for comparable goods and services. Is what you're paying comparable, or could you go down the street and get it for a lot less? Are you dealing with someone because that you like that company, but the cost is way higher than what you could get the same comparable goods for elsewhere. So that's the first question. Is it recognized as ordinary and necessary for the operation or performance of the program? In other words, is this a typical thing that you would see in a school or used in a school? Okay. Is a mahogany desk really reasonable? And is it something that's ordinary and necessary, or could you suffice with perhaps a more modest desk? Do you follow your own procurement procedures? You have procedures that have to do with bids on certain items that we'll take a look a little bit later, but are you following your own procedures? We've had districts who have had compliance findings because they didn't follow their own procurement procedures. They had them written down, but nobody knew about them or nobody followed them. And one of the areas we're seeing the reasonableness test applied is for administrative caps for programs that don't have a legislative cap. In those cases, in the consolidated application, those of you that were part of that workshop probably heard, we talked about programs like Title II that don't have a legislative cap. If you exceed a certain percentage, you're going to be questioned based on reasonableness, and this is where that comes from. This is where the reasonableness factor comes in. All right. Okay. So this is the prudent person, and this is out of, again, grants management. A cost is reasonable that doesn't exceed that which a prudent person under the same circumstances would make. So if that decision was made during COVID, then a prudent person might have had to pay a higher price for something. But that's what you need to document and make sure you're following. Are you behaving like them? Are you spending your federal money the same way you would your district money? And are you spending your federal money the same way you would what's in your own pocket? Do you have that level of prudence? Or you say, it's federal money, we can buy that. Okay? So this is exactly what they're talking about, the prudent person test. And we know you're all prudent. So you passed the test, I'm sure. Finally, and out of the big three, is allocable. And what allocable means is, can you show that the cost results in a benefit to the program that it's paying for it? So why did you pay for this item or service with this particular program dollar? Consider direct administration. We now have programs that allow you to pay separately for direct administration versus your indirect costs. So direct administration now, you'll see all the programs focus more on how are you showing that administrative cost directly supports the program. That it's not just a general administrator who sits, or secretaries are one that came up and they're specifically addressed, that they should be considered indirect costs unless you can show and you have documentation, duty statements that show how they are directly supporting that program. The other area it comes up is on multi-funded activities. You need to make sure those are adequately documented, because if you have more than one activity benefiting, are the funds being divided proportionately? Is it 80-20? And if you're charging it that way, does the 80% program get 80% of the services? And duty statements are one way that you can describe services that directly support the program. So your duty statement can help you demonstrate allocability. But allocability is kind of the third big factor to look at. So is it necessary for carrying out the program? Is the cost reasonable? And is it allocable? Can you show it benefits that program? Those are the three biggies. The others on the next slide are, first of all, treated, again, not prohibited by state or local law. That can mean two things. It could mean that it's a violation of law for a particular activity under your state law. It could also mean that the state has imposed a more significant restriction on the funds. So, for example, there's Title I has an 85% cap on direct services. 85% direct services, a 15% cap, on administrative costs. That's a state law. So you can't break the state law, even though Title I says nothing about 85-15, but state law does have that. Treated consistently. This is important. That do you treat your federal funds in the same way you treat your state funds, or do your policies and procedures, do you apply them consistently? The point here is that you don't say, well, these are federal funds. I wouldn't typically do this with our money, but it's federal money, so we can do it. No, they have to be treated consistently. Same rules have to apply. Adequately documented. The rules say 3 years. We recommend 5 because an audit can go back 5 years. Not included as a match. What that means, if you have a matching requirement for any grant, you can't use federal funds to make that match. You have to use your general funds for the match. Net of applicable credits. I know everyone was waiting to get there. What that means, if you get a rebate or some sort of a credit or savings, it doesn't go into the general fund. If you bought it with federal funds, that rebate has to go back to the federal program. So those are some of the key federal cost principles that are important to know if you're going to be responsible for federal programs. There's one other section. It's called Selected Items of Cost, and there are it's a list of 54 items, and it actually lists them alphabetically, and you can determine if they're saying it's allowable, it's not allowable. Sometimes you can read that very clearly. It's a yes, no, like alcohol is in there, of course. That's a definite no, but a lot of them are gray areas with a lot of well, ifs and ands and maybes. But it is worth looking at. If you have a particular activity, see if it's included. You'll note compensation, which we're going to talk about, and that's time and effort and allowability and reporting. It's included in the selected items of cost and 400.430. Okay. And so next, let's take a look at some of them. And here's just an example. And the first is entertainment. And entertainment is listed, and it is the cost of includes amusement, diversion, social activities. Any associated costs are unallowable. So entertainment, amusement, diversion, social, unallowable, except where specific costs have a programmatic purpose and are authorized in the approved budget for the federal award, or you get prior approval. This is where a lot of people get into trouble with field trips. Okay, field trips are not unallowable, but field trips often get a question or indicated as unallowable because they are classified as entertainment, amusement parks and things like that. Oh, there's history of lots of Knott's Berry Farm. Well, auditors often don't see it that way. So this is one example. Another example on the next slide is student activity costs. And here, costs for intramural activities, student publications, clubs, other student activities are unallowable unless there's a specific reason that's provided in the federal award. So you're looking for those allowable costs. Is that somehow allowed in this award? Otherwise, no, student activity costs. Advertising and public relations is one I'd encourage you to look at because it's quite long and there's a lot in there. But basically they say those are only can be used for recruitment of personnel, goods, services, outreach to meet the specific purposes of the grant. So general costs aren't allowable, and they list unallowable as costs for meetings, conventions, and events related to other activities, promotional items, memorabilia, gifts, souvenirs. Advertising solely to promote the non-federal entity are not allowable. So, Williams High School is the best is not an allowable expenditure to pay for t-shirts, to have that on, right? But a lot more included in that. And I think now I am going to turn it over to Adrienne, who's going to go deeper into time and effort.
Thank you, Bonnie. Time and effort reporting. I'm sure it's your favorite topic. Definitely, it's our favorite topic. So now we're going to take a look at time and effort reporting. And as you know, or if you're new and you don't know, this is an area that can result in significant repayment of funds if it is not done or it's not done correctly. So it's important that you're aware. Federal regulations require time and effort documentation, in addition to, say, time cards that you might have for all personnel who receive any payment or compensation from federal funds. The documentation will depend and will vary depending on the funding source in terms of whether it's Title I, Title II, Title III, or IV, as well as the nature of the job duties. Payroll time reporting must also reflect the actual hours that were worked on each program as indicated and aligned to your time and effort certification documents. So again, there must be alignment between compensation and the documentation that memorializes what has been done. And this must be done no matter how much funding, federal funding, is included in their salary, whether it's a penny or it's 100%. This triggers the time and effort reporting. So where does this come from? It comes from the CFR 200.43I. And here it's the requirement that it revises standards for federal time and effort reporting. And so at this point, it's now based on your LEA's internal control system that follows the required policies and procedures that you have in place. The federal requirements do not specify now the use of semi-annual certification and the personnel activity reports, also known as PAR, except that it does require the use of PARs if the standard is not met. So to be sure that the standards are met, most LEAs typically use the PAR, the personnel activity reports, and the semi-annual certifications because it's probably the safest way to go. Also, the California School Accounting Manual continues to reference PARs and the semi-annual certifications in Procedure 905. So it generally defaults to the old method because, again, we know that it does pass the requirements of the standards being met. The time and effort documentation must be based on records that reflect the work performed. It must be supported by a system of internal control, and it is incorporated into the LEA's official records. So there has to be a paper trail on this. It must reasonably reflect the total activity for which the employee is being compensated and encompass federally assisted and all other activities for which the employee is compensated. So 100% of an employee's time must be included, and it must comply with the established accounting practices as stated in your policies and procedures. And it must align with the stated cost objectives. And this is why the previous system of PARs and semi-annual certifications are good, because they address these requirements. After the employee has completed the time and effort reporting, you must true up at the end of the year. You can't just say you think this is what will happen. This time and effort process is a continuous process. So you have to ask yourself, how does your system look for accuracy? Who reviews the time and effort reports? Each one of them. Who trains the staff? And other questions like this. Your policies and procedures must take into consideration that budget estimates determined before the work is performed alone do not qualify. Your system for establishing these budget estimates produce reasonable approximations of the actual service performed. But the system must identify and respond to any significant changes in the work activity as defined in the LEA's policies, and it must be entered into the records in a timely manner. And keep in mind that short-term fluctuations, say 1 to 2 months, need not be considered as long as the distribution of salary and wages is reasonable over the long term, because all the necessary adjustments will need to be made so that the final amount charged to the federal program is accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. And this is why your internal control system must include a process for the after the fact review of reports. So let's take a look at how LEAs typically report time and effort. What triggers the type of reporting is based on the activities or the cost objectives reflecting that service that's being provided. As I stated before, while the specific types of reports are no longer in the Uniform Grant Guidance, they are still referenced in the Csam or the California Schools Accounting Manual. There's generally two types of certifications. One is the Personnel Activity Report, otherwise known as PAR, and this is generally used for the employees who work on multiple cost objectives. And there is the semi-annual certification for employees who work on a single cost objective. So what is a cost objective? Let's look at the cost objective definition, which is a function, organizational, subdivision, contract, grant, or other cost activity for which cost data are needed and for which costs are incurred. It's often hard, at least for me, it's often hard to understand at first. 200.420I states that it supports distribution of salary among specific activities or cost objectives. A single cost objective is a set of work activities where both the services being performed and the population being served are allowable under any of the programs supporting the cost objective. Usually this is a single program and funding source. However, multiple funding sources may address a single common objective. Both the activity and the targeted population being served is allowable under all funding sources. So for example, Title I and Title II professional development for reading intervention strategies for low achieving students. In this case, both the populations being served and the activity being provided could be funded 100% from either program. So this could be a single cost objective. This example could be paid from one funding source or multiple funding source. So the test or the question to ask yourself is, could you pay the employee 100% from each fund? The other cost objective is multiple cost objective, and this usually involves more than one funding source or different activities for different purposes. A single funding source or program may include multiple objectives. For example, services that are Title I direct services and Title I administration would have to be reported as separate cost objectives. So keep in mind, the question is, for a single funding source, do these activities and expenditures need to be tracked and accounted for separately? If that's the case, then you do have a multiple cost objective. So the bottom line for time and effort is that employees paid with any federal funds must keep records to support time and effort benefiting the federal program. The LEA must have written procedures in place describing how this will take place in the LEA. All employees paid for from one source or cost objective require a more detailed reporting. And the differences between actual time and effort report and budgets must be reconciled so that the work reports match the budgeted amounts. And because this involves salary and benefits, compliance findings for time and effort can result in significant payback of funds. So now we're going to take a look at what specific documents are required as evidence, not only just to have, but also if you're FPM'd. The first one is a duty statement. And in many of the instruments, they ask for, in time and effort, they'll ask for a duty statement along with either the PAR or the semi-annual certification. So here's a sample of a duty statement for an academic intervention teacher being paid 100% out of Title I. And the duties are unique to each person's daily activities. So here we have Gabe Cotter at Buchanan High School, and he's paid 100% out of Title I. Using the duty statement of Gabe Cotter, the academic intervention teacher, this single cost objective intervention teacher would use a semi-annual certification document, and it might look like this. For semi-annual certifications, it must be after the fact. It must account for total activity. It must be signed by the employee or supervisor, and it must be done every 6 months or at least twice a year. For an employee that has multiple cost objectives, CDE has shared this sample of a PAR, or Personnel Activity Report. The person's daily activities are detailed by time and funding sources, and it must include it must be after the fact. It must account for the total activity. This one must be signed by the employee. It must be prepared at least monthly and coincide with one or more pay periods. And again, as you can see, it has the activities for the day, and it has the hours included and the funding source. This particular part of the process can be quite tedious and time-consuming for employees. So this is why it's important that as leaders of the district, that you create a system that will assist the staff members in completing the PAR with ease. Another certification worth mentioning is a blanket certification. And the federal guidance says if a supervisor has firsthand knowledge of work performed by several employees on the same cost objective, then a single certification may be used. But just remember, you must list all of the employees, the cost objective worked in accordance with duty statement, the time period that's being covered, and it must be signed by the supervisor. And you can find this in Csam Procedure 905. Another document that is required is a position control document, otherwise known as a PCD. Here is a sample that CDE recently shared, and it's basically an Excel spreadsheet, and it has all the required components within it. It must include the full name of the employee. It must have the position title in full. It needs to be, it can't be abbreviated. It's supposed to be filled out completely. The funding, the percentage of each funding, the hours worked. And if it is for the Title I program, you must indicate the 85-15% and the allowable reservation. So this would be a complete PCD. Another document that is required is the LEA Title I Reservations and Services document. And so for this document, it must detail the Title I services being provided for each reservation as indicated in CARS. Documentation must include details about the Title I services for each reservation, include the budgeted expenditures, and it should be aligned to your consolidated application. So again, all of these documents work together between the fiscal side and the program side, as we have shared earlier today. And so again, it's making sure that both sides are communicating, that everyone is aware of the policies and procedures that are in place, and that everyone is following them. And so now I will turn it over to Bonnie, who will continue with the discussion of internal controls.
Sorry. Thank you, Adrienne, and really appreciate you sharing on that. Spoken like a real trooper who's lived time and effort reporting, so we appreciate that. All right, next we're going to move to looking at internal controls and policies and procedures. And we started today by saying that the regulations are based on the presumption that the local educational agency is responsible for ensuring proper use of funds and ensuring that you avoid waste, fraud, or abuse in federal programs. So that's given as a responsibility. And foundational to that are having in place systems of internal controls. And as we'll see, policies and procedures are a key way of operationalizing that. So let's look at the next slide. What's the definition of internal controls? And it is actually included in the definitions in the Code of Federal Regulations, and it's described as a process implemented by a non-federal entity, right, designed to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of objectives for the program, and in the following categories. So effectiveness and efficiency of your operation, reliability of reporting for internal and external use, and compliance with applicable state laws. So internal controls and procedures should support those outcomes. And developing them begins with assessing the risks the LEA faces and designing procedures to mitigate risks, analyze and correct them when they occur. So when you start with a risk assessment, every district's different, and you know what are the things in your district that may make it difficult to implement programs, may cause problems. That could be new staff. Maybe you've had a big staff turnover. That's a risk factor. Maybe you're getting a new program that you've never had before, and you're trying to figure out how to implement it. That's a risk factor. So start by identifying those. Next is the purpose. So again, it kind of reiterates what we just said, but really the purpose of internal controls is to ensure that the agency has systems in place to, first of all, prevent instances of waste, fraud, or abuse. That's ideal. What are you doing to prevent there being misuse of funds? Secondly, to detect something if it is going wrong. If something's happening, life isn't perfect, things happen, and you need to detect it, or are these things going under the radar? And third, how do you correct it? So your internal controls should have processes in place to stop things from happening that would result in waste, fraud, or abuse, detect them when they are happening, and fix them if they do occur. So the non-federal entity, again, local education agencies, have to maintain controls that, first of all, of course, comply with the Constitution, federal statutes, and the terms and conditions of the awards. That's the law. That's what we said, first of all, is the statute. So you have to comply with the statute. Secondly, they need to evaluate and monitor your compliance with the statute regulations. So how are you internally evaluating whether you're operating compliant programs? So this means instead of running around when someone says, oh, you're going to get an FPM, and oh my gosh, we haven't had one in 5 years. What are we going to do? Let's grab some things and put it together. No, that should be an ongoing process. You're continually seeing, are we compliant in areas? And if you know there's a problem, you'll know it ahead of time so you can fix it. And then that's the last one. Take prompt action when instances of non-compliance are identified. If you find them, you don't ignore them, you do something about it. And that's the uncomfortable part sometimes, but that's what really needs to happen. And these need to be based on, you'll see up at the top in the first paragraph, they reference the standards for control in the federal government issued by the Comptroller General of the United States. And this is the link down there is to those standards. It's a great guide to how you assess your agency to ensure that you have good internal controls in place to conduct risk assessments. It gives you checklists and documents, very helpful information, but that's what it should be based on. So let's take a look at what that looks like. And essentially, that document looks at 5 interrelated components. And the first is the control environment. This is the most critical one and the most challenging one, because this has to do with management's messaging, management's behavior in terms of compliance. In other words, does top management support that you will have compliant programs? Does that come forth in how they communicate to staff, in their messaging, in their behavior, in their expectations? That's huge, because that's kind of a difficult one to address. But if you do have these checklists, it does give you some ways to kind of look at that. Next is what we talked about was a risk assessment, and that's an individual district look at what is it in our district that might be problematic that we need to keep our eyes on and watch out for. Next step is putting in place control activities. What are the things we're going to do to check to make sure things are going correctly and that we are running compliant programs. They also address information and communication. One of the key ones for me is that information needs to go in 3 directions at least. The typical is down the organization. Memos, they always come out. Memos, cabinet says, they all go out to people. That's one thing. The next is, how's information go back and forth among departments? So how do you communicate with your fiscal office? Are there formal and informal processes for that communication to take place? And importantly, for compliance purposes, how does information go up the organization? What that means is, how does Harry at the bottom of the pack, when he sees something wrong, what's the process for communicating it? Because, those are the people that know what's going on, people that are doing the work, and they can see a problem coming, a storm coming. And if they don't have a process for communicating that to management, then you're just going to have problems occurring. So that's the next one. And then finally is monitoring. What are your processes for monitoring your program? So again, that's all from the standards for internal control in the federal government. The internal controls are kind of supported by another requirement in the guidance, and that's for policies and procedures. They're an integral part to actually operationalizing your internal controls. They define how the LEA will operationalize their implementation of oversight of federal programs. We'll take a look at a few of those. Excuse me. These are some of the policies and procedures that LEAs need to have in place, and these are the references where you can find them. Many of these are probably in your fiscal office somewhere. These are nothing new. Most of them have been around for a while. Some of them have changed the requirements, but those of you who aren't familiar with them, if you're working the programs, need to say, where's our allowability of costs, procedures, and policies, and where's our procurement, just so you're aware of your part in it. Next, we'll look at what they are. So what's the difference between, we get that a lot, what's the difference between a policy and a procedure? Policies are really the goals and the directives of the organization. This comes from management, that what's our policy? And it's used to communicate to employees the desired outcomes for the organization. It may or may not require official board adoption. Many of these are policies that, and that's kind of a local decision, which of them may be more appropriate for board approval, but many of them are just cabinet decisions and administrative decisions about what's our policy about time and effort reporting or about allowability. The procedures are the most of them, and this what you'll find when you go to the California School Boards Association. You'll find the policies, and then you'll find administrative regulations, and that's more like the procedures. The procedures are specific methods employed in the day-to-day operations of the organization to make sure the goals are met. So procedures don't require any board approval. I really encourage you to take a look at your own and not just grab them. Sometimes we found CSBA policies are not up to date, and particularly your procedures. Those need to be specific to your organization because it needs to say who in what position is going to do what. They should be a step-by-step process. Procedures are not a reiteration of the requirements. We will ensure. No, it needs to be what are we actually going to do, who's going to do it, and how we know it gets done. Next slide is a sample. One of the procedures that was on that initial slide was allowability. And this we chose because this really impacts both program and fiscal offices, that the LEA needs written procedures for determining the allowability of costs. And that's in accordance with those cost principles that we mentioned earlier. So what that should include is the factors you're going to use to determine allowability, who's going to be included in making those determinations, and what's the approval process for expenditures. The next slide is from actually from the Wisconsin Department of Education. Did a nice job of pulling together in there. This is in our handbook that we mentioned earlier. So a list of questions to think about for allowability. I thought they did a very good job on kind of thinking this through. But number one, who creates the budget for the federal program? How's that happen? Who does it? that happen over in the business office? Program? Do you work together? Who verifies allowability of each cost under the federal program and under Uniform Grants Guidance? So whose job is that to say this is or this isn't allowable? And when cost changes occur within a program, who gets notified? Sometimes we hear, I can think of instances on all of these where that wasn't in place, where a program person says, somebody in the business office just switched that. What's the process for that happening? Who should know about that? That's important for program. And you can have a non-compliant finding because somebody changed a position and that person isn't doing that task. When cost changes are identified, what's the timeline for submitting a budget amendment? Who's notified? Who's responsible for generating supporting documentation to determine it's reasonable, necessary, and allocable? What's that documentation? Where do you keep it? Whose responsibility is that? Who identifies if the staff are single or multiple cost objective? Adrian just went through how to determine that, but who makes that call and how's that communicated? And then what documentation or processes are used to support the amount budgeted and who verifies the accuracy? So how do you make sure that those costs are accurately documented? So that should all be consideration in your policies for allowability. The next one looks at procurement, and that's just how you purchase items. So what you need in most, I would think most districts and LEAs have these in place, but good to look at them and make sure that everyone's aware. But what are your procedures for awarding contracts and hiring contractors? This is critical. This is an area where you can have a lot of issues come up if you don't follow procedures, because sometimes a contractor is somebody knows. How do you avoid conflict of interest? And as you can see later on, that's one of the things that has to be addressed. How do you select someone? How do you know someone's brother isn't working for the company that's selling you all those items? And that's why you're going to them. For micro purchases, there is a requirement, NUG, that you have to the extent practicable that you distribute your purchases equitably among suppliers. So if you're ordering small things, do you always go to one place? And if you do, you need to have backup. What's the reason for that? Because you're not then being equitable among all your suppliers. For small purchases, are you getting quotations? These can be verbal quotations from at least 2 vendors. Who does that? How does that happen? Bid process, a lot of people get in trouble with this. They don't go through a formal bid process, whether it's an open or sealed bid. How's sole sourcing determined? In other words, you have to go to bid on certain items, and there's criteria. If you say this is the only sole source, I have to use this vendor. How do you document that? Who decides that? And what's the evaluation criteria when you go through bids? Conflict of interest, we mentioned that. Those people that are involved in selecting and awarding contracts, how do you ensure there's not conflict of interest? And instances where somebody's relative or friend that's who gets the contract. What do you have in place to avoid that? Contract administration, who checks to make sure your contractors actually do the work in accordance with the terms and conditions that was specified in the contract? Or maybe in the purchase order, they should not be paid until that's verified. Are you paying people before someone checks to see is the work actually done? And did it meet what's in the contract? We sometimes hear that the people, I'll be honest, we hear people are reticent to question contractors or ask them to do their job. They'll say, oh, I'll take care of it. No, if you hired someone to do a job and that's in the contract, you need to make sure they do it or withhold payment. Again, conflicts of interest, we said that a lot. That seems to be a biggie. Procurement. This is there's a requirement in the guidance that you avoid acquisition of duplicative or unnecessary items. So how do you know that that item you just purchased isn't sitting in a warehouse somewhere not used that you could use it, or it's at another school and they don't need it anymore? What's your process to ensure you're not just buying things? Again, this goes, are you treating your federal funds consistently with your state funds? Would you go out and buy that with state funds? Oh, it's federal funds. Doesn't matter if we've got 10 of them. You are not allowed to purchase things without determining that it's not duplicative or unnecessary. All right. Time and effort, we already spent a lot of time on, but just to reiterate, you need policies and procedures for your time and effort reporting that address all things Adrian talked about, but they also need to follow all the steps. And if you go to 200 430I, they provide you all the steps. So how are you documenting it? How are you ensuring it's reconciled to make sure it's correct at the end of the year and correctly posted? So what that time and effort reported matches what you're paying. So policies and procedures required for time and effort. And we did on the next slide, just throw in a reminder we've had for a while. Remember, under COVID, we're reminded if you have unexpected or extraordinary circumstances that have changed your time and effort process in some way, then you need to have some sort of change in your policy to address that. And finally, we'll talk about this more tomorrow, and that's property management. Basically, that's looking at equipment procedures. So how do you determine classifications for various purchases? And because that impacts how it's treated. Is it equipment, supplies, computing devices? And we mentioned computing devices. This has been an area of focus for OMB because they're usually, in California, usually they're because we have a $500 threshold for equipment, and they often fall into it, but they can fall below that. And what they refer to these two are small and attractive items. In other words, there are things that can walk away easily, iPads, and other kinds of small devices. So what's your process? You should have some sort of process in place for safeguarding those items. Your inventory records, do they include all the required information? We will go over that tomorrow. Physical inventory has to be conducted every 2 years. Who does it? How's it done? How do you reconcile it with the records? Where's that documentation maintained? And then lost and stolen items. What are your procedures for reporting them? And what are your safeguards, particularly for those small computing devices? So tomorrow, Adrian's going to go into that a little bit more. And we did have a couple questions, and I think we can answer Ed Relief. Yeah, the Ed Relief Funds, good question. If the Ed Relief Funds would put you over the in some cases might, I should say, put you over the $700,000 threshold for the audit process. So that was a question. So will Ed Relief Funds, does that push me over? Yes. I know some of you first started taking Title I because you wanted to get the Ed Relief Funds, and like there's two sides to everything. The other side is now you have some audit requirements. And the other one had to do with Title I, not supplement, not supplant. And we're going to address that tomorrow a little bit more in depth. Let's see. Will it be the same tomorrow? No, we'll go over in just a moment what the topics are for tomorrow. And expand on. How are we doing? 5 minutes. Let me see. Is there anything? So, oh, the Excel document. Yeah, the slide. Yes, we'll look at doing that. Can you include the link samples? A lot of requests for samples. Yes, we'll do that. Excuse me. The reservation of the. I don't know, Adrian, you did there's a question about, can you elaborate on the reservation portion of the position control sample?
Yes. Let's see. Provide with a purpose. Yes. So this is required as part of the documentation that aligns with your time and effort reporting, the PAR or the semi-annual. So the district or the charter would need to also keep a PCD, the fiscal side, as well as the reservations if you're receiving Title I funds. So all of these documents have to be completed and filled out. And when the reviewer looks at it, they use all of these and they align them. So The purpose, I think, again, is the information on the PCD is kind of a summary of the employees and the funding source and the percentage of what they're working. And then again, they match that against the actual time and reporting documents as well as interviews. If you're being reviewed in person, on site, they will actually interview using like asking questions that relate to the duty statement and the purpose of their time accounting.
Okay. And Jose asked about this on short-term fluctuations in time and effort reporting, and what essentially that means. If you have an employee and their time and effort report doesn't exactly match for 1 month, maybe what their salary is, and just a little bit of difference in there, that you don't have to go into the books and make those budget transfers immediately, but you do have to have it true up at the end of the year. So say their time and effort, they're supposed to be 80-20 and it showed they were 70-30 that month or something. You don't need to immediately correct that you go in, but at the end of the year, it's got to add up to the penny. So that's what that 1 to 2 month fluctuation is. Yeah, you bring up a good point. ELO. Answers on ELO are very slow and vague incoming, I've got to say. And the question we've gotten is about state restricted programs. We didn't talk about that. What is a state restricted program? But essentially, if there are requirements that parameters for the grant, like ELO has, and if there's a need to sort of track that, and you may be asked to provide evidence on it, then we would say it's a restricted program. And in terms of a duty statement, I think it would certainly be safe, because there are some things in there like about working after school and during school. And I'm not an ELO expert, but I just know there are some things about staff and personnel that are a little particular in that grant. And I think you would definitely be on the safe side to have that in place in case that comes up in audits or anything in the future. So yeah. Okay. And we will send, I think, all the others. So tomorrow, what we're going to be looking at are timelines for spending federal funds, cost allocation terms, and then we're going to look at the questions we had: maintenance of effort, comparability, and supplement, not supplant, how it applies in different programs, equipment and contracts, and oversight for that, federal cash management, and then we'll touch on federal stimulus funds. So that's what we have for tomorrow. If we missed anything in the chat, we will address it, but also please email us if our SFP mailbox, if you come up with questions between now and then on any of those topics or anything else, and we'll be happy to address them. Thanks so much. We really appreciate being with you today, and hope to see you tomorrow. Take care.